So this is chapter 6, physical development, the body and the brain. So our learning objectives for this chapter will be how we take a look at children as well as the adolescents. Got to talk about how children go into adolescence in terms of brain development and the structures, how their bodies start to change, what type of factors would shape motor development, as well as looking at how nutrition plays a role within child development. So, we talked about it in other chapters about the structures of the brain and how a child would think as they're developing. And as we look at those parts and functions of the brain, we have to look into different sections. And basically, it's going to get clearer as we look at all the parts of the brain because we use more than just one part. There are two halves, being hemispheres, and some parts of those brains are going to be found on both sides, and a lot of times we think that, oh, we're left-brained, we're right-brained, but when we talk about the motor cortex, we know that it controls the body's movement, similar on both sides, not just one side. But understand, our language centers of the brain will appear on the left side, and that's going to be up to 95% of the right-hand people, and then 75% for lefties. So the two sides of the brain, they have to communicate with one another in order for language to be developed, movement to work, and the structure that joins them together, that's called the corpus callosum. Okay. So again, although the two sides have distinct functions from each other, there's no such thing as it being totally right-brained or left-brained. Both halves of our brains are going to be involved, particularly with complex tasks, in order for us to do anything in life. Now, let's take a deeper look at the structures. First, let's start off with the brainstem. Understand this is the most primitive part of our brain, and it's going to control our basic survival instincts such as breathing, our heart rate, as well as sleep. The cerebellum is going to be located at the top of our brainstem, and it'll receive information that's related to sensory. Okay, the sensory systems, that being with the spinal cord as well as other parts of our brain that help coordinate our balance, be able to help us with voluntary movements like this. That's voluntary, yeah. Know that the cerebellum and the cortex, it's going to account for at least 2/3 of our brain mass and handles the higher functionings of our thoughts as well as our actions and behaviors. So the cerebrum, this has a lot of different parts in it, and it's including our occipital lobe, and that helps with our vision. The temporal lobe is going to be helping us with our hearing or auditory information, as well as allow us to understand language. The parietal lobe helps to take in sensory information in regards to our taste, our temperatures, touch, and it's integrated or processed with the frontal lobe. And of course, the frontal lobe I call the executive because it deals with complex thoughts, our planning, how movement works, language, as well as our impulses. Okay. So then we'll speak about the amygdala as well as the hippocampus. Okay, and that's what the slide is showing you in terms of looking at a close-up shot. So the amygdala, this helps with our emotions as well as our moods. The hippocampus is going to help us with our memory. It processes and stores the memory. So although this helps to give you a good description of some of the functions that's associated with the different areas of the brain, understand that research with brain development is pretty much one of the most active areas when we talk about child development. Because the ability to be able to understand brain functions and how it develops will help us to be able to change different situations that might be going on with children. And we'll talk further about that in the chapter. as term as if there's any disorders present or so forth. So looking at developmental processes, again, brains continuously changing and developing starting from infancy all the way into adolescence. So right now what we're going to look at is ways to be able to describe development and the connections between the nerve cells. And you know that those connections are called synapses, as well as looking at, excuse me, development of the myelin sheath that helps to cover the nerve cells. So one thing you'd be surprised possibly of understanding about our personal experiences is the way that our brain forms connections with the synapses and develops that myelin sheath. Neurons and synaptic connections in our brains are going to be approximately 86 billion nerve cells. And remember, those nerve cells are called neurons. So with each nerve cell it sends a message, and it's going to be coming through those special chemicals which are called neurotransmitters, and it's going to basically communicate to other nerve cells through the extensions that's called axons, and it'll take in messages through the receptors that are dendrites. So the place where our axon is from one neuron will meet the dendrite of another neuron, and that in the between right there, if you look at it like this, would be the synapse. So just about all the things that we do really depends on how our neurons or nerve cells are communicating with one another. So those neurotransmitters are going to be released from one cell, and then it's going to bring the message into the second cell. So in terms of development adults, we have about approximately one quadrillion of these synaptic connections. And the neurons and the synaptic connections are going to, they're made up, is called the gray matter of our brain. So we have a whole lot going on up there. Now, when we're looking at this slide, it's talking about synaptogenesis, okay? And one thing I want to mention, in the module section, you're going to see chapter 6. There's going to be a host of different things that I want you to make sure throughout this entire week that you're looking at everything. It's mandatory. It's not something optional. Everything that's published and open for you to look at, including videos that's on the chapter. It's also going to be helping you as far as with different articles that's available. I want you to make sure you're getting this all in, not just the pretty sound of my voice, okay? But there is a video that I do want you to watch that is going to help you understand about synaptogenesis, which is called the baby's brain. If there's an issue or a problem when you go to watch it, please send me a message in the inbox, and I'll make sure I get it to you some way, somehow, okay? But when we talk about the neurons and synapses, you got to know that there's two nerve cells. The neurons are going to be connected to each other, as I mentioned, with the axon and the dendrites communicating through those with the neurotransmitter, okay? At the synapse, those neurotransmitters are going to release from one cell and bring the message again, like I said, to the other, okay? So neurons will connect with the axon and dendrites, and another neuron at the synapse. There will be times when, though, there's an overproduction of synapses, and that's during the infancy stage. And understand that the brain, when it sees that it has so many like that, it will prune away some of it when it's not being really used, okay? So infants, they're born with almost all the neurons that we'll ever have in our lifetime. But relatively speaking, those few synapses, again, is going to be used between. So the pruning process will occur. Now, our brain takes in so much information right? And it has a lot of complex and difficult tasks that it performs each and every day. The ability of an infant's brain to be able to change and form and be able to function is called plasticity. So when we're adults, grown up, understand that half of our brain, which is one hemisphere, if we were to remove it, the result would be catastrophic. Because what did I say earlier? Both sides of the brain have to help one another. Okay? So, for example, you might lose movement in the opposite side of your body. Uh, you might lose functions that is handling that particular hemisphere. However, until a child is around 4 or 5, the one hemisphere removed would be treated as otherwise untreatable conditions such as epilepsy, but can really almost recover full function at that age. There was a study that they did on children who had an entire temporal lobe removed, where there was no significant decline within the group's overall IQ following that surgery. So even when the surgery was where they took the left temporal lobe, and that again is going to be part of the brain's association with language, which of course we usually use. For the children that was tested and had the surgery where they removed it, there was really no loss of verbal intelligence, and the nonverbal intellectual functioning actually increased and improved. Okay, this happened because the brain at that age, being so young, had enough plasticity in there so that the brain cells was able to uh, was supposed to serve one function actually knew to take on some other activities to help compensate for it. So in turn, those cells that controlled that one function took on another instead. So understand that we have what we call experience expectant brain development and then the experience dependent brain development. So at various times within the first years of life, babies' brains are going to produce a whole lot of different synaptic connections that helps in terms of the density of connections would be greater than what would be found in our brains now. Okay? But understand that many of those connections, they're not going to survive. And again, we talked about pruning just now. Pruning is going to occur here as well. Give me one moment. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to say. Yes, so I wanted to just freshen it up and just say the experience expected mechanism is going to help brain development because our brains will expect certain things to happen, certain events to occur. So think about it in this way. During normal type of events, our eyes will be exposed to light, the textbook talks about. And when their expected events happen, what happens is the pathways used, they're going to retain this information. So it's the classic experiment like with the kittens that Hubble and Weisel did that showed that it does not happen. The eyes still continue to develop normally. But then there's that part of the brain that will process visual information and it won't function. So in that study, the kittens with one eye closed for a period of time after birth, they really never was able to develop their vision well in that eye. And when the eye later opened, it was really fuzzy and not working too properly. So in terms of children, why children who have an eye that has considerable less vision or doesn't coordinate with the other eye, this condition will be called amblyopia or lazy eye. But it must have an intervention early in order for it to be improved and be able to work. Otherwise, it's considered turned off. Now, in terms of the experience-dependent brain development, this here is much more individual and it'll depend on the person's particular experiences that occurs to them. Additionally, when we don't use those synapses and they're pruned away, new synapses can develop in response to the new experience or stimulation. All right, so now you heard me talk about the myelin sheath. So let's talk about why is it important for the myelin sheath to help in terms of the neurons. Understand that this is another necessary process in the development of our nervous system. So for neurons to be able to work effectively, basically the myelin sheath, it coats with a fatty substance, which is myelin. It's coating the axons that's going to help connect the neurons and help with the white matter of the brain. It helps speeds along the information so that the brain can get it and use it effectively. So those neurons in the nervous systems are insulated with the myelin, and then the message from neurotransmitter is going to be sent and received better. So in terms of talking about infants, when babies are born, just as we talked about the synaptic connections not really being complete, same holds true about the myelin sheath. It doesn't fully cover all the nerves in the nervous system at that time. So the process of producing synaptic connections or the pruning away of those that's not being used, those myelinating connections going to be left and a help throughout childhood as well as adolescence. So myelination, it'll start in the lower centers of the base of the brain, and then it continues throughout the higher centers of our cortex. Research has demonstrated that more normal progression of myelination is going to more likely happen. They found that there's evidence of abnormal processes that might contribute to some of the disorders like schizophrenia or autistic spectrum disorder. So we already talked about synaptogenesis and how it affects our experiences through the experience-dependent brain development. So there's also been evidence that the myelination will help affect our experiences as well. So Bengelson had talked about a study and completed a study in which they did a comparison on brain development with children who spent a whole lot of hours practicing piano. Do you play piano? I don't. I played the flute. But needless to say, those children who had spent long hours practicing the piano, and then they compared them to children who did not play the piano at all. Evidence indicated that there was an extra level of stimulation in certain neurons with the experience when children are practicing. And this is because the myelination of those neurons were building and being in place. So areas that it included was the corpus callosum, which again connects the two hemispheres of our brain. And the corpus callosum basically is involved with our ability to be able to coordinate movements, hand-eye coordination, our ability to use two hands at the same time in terms of the people who are playing the piano. So this particular study, kids who played the piano really had more brain efficiency, and they demonstrated an increased abilities all the way throughout adolescence. All right, so now I'm going to take a sip. One moment. Sorry about that. All right, so let's move on. We're talking now brain development and looking at it through the span of childhood and adolescence. You have to understand that there are specific brain structures that'll experience growth during middle childhood, and more or less that's going to include our frontal lobe, it's going to include the parietal lobe, as well as the corpus callosum. So growth of the corpus callosum is really important because it helps with connectivity as well as our coordination, like I mentioned. And it's going to also help between the different areas of the brain in terms of our motor skills, our visual spatial skills, as well as our coordination. Uh, there's still going to be synaptic pruning happening in middle childhood, and it'll help children to be able to use fewer and more select regions of our brain in order to be able to complete tasks that they're performing, and allows them to be able to perform it effectively. So, once they're in earlier adolescence, then there's another type of overproduction of synapses is occurring. This time it's happening within the frontal lobes of the brain. So until that overproduction of those synaptic connections are pruned away, results are going to be more about inefficiency about our thoughts. So the child's thought processes aren't going to be really fully working great, because at that point the pruning process hasn't occurred and myelination hasn't had its chance to get in there. So at that point it's kind of slowed down. So think of it this way with children and adolescents, looking at pictures of a face, and we talk about facial expressions, or they hear a word that might or might not match the expression. It took 11 and 12-year-olds, took them to correctly decide whether the image or word match a little slower actually than younger or older participants within the study. Those middle ones, they kind of struggled a bit. So the decrease in the early adolescent performance was really attributed to that proliferation of synapses at that age. And then the increased efficiency later on in adolescence is because the pruning finally happened. So now they got rid of the excess, thinking became more clearer, they was able to pick up on it much faster. All right, so I mentioned about when things are not happening right a few slides ago, talking about some problems that might happen in terms of disorders that's going to be related to brain development. First one we're going to speak about is cerebral palsy. Now, this is a term that describes how the brain disorders affecting their ability to move or be able to maintain balance as well as their posture. Individuals with cerebral palsy may demonstrate difficulties with their muscle tone, their ability to coordinate movement, as well as their speech patterns. The condition is caused because of an abnormal development or damage to it. And it could have been either prenatally, it could have happened during the birth process or after birth, all the way up to at least age 3 years old. Okay? So in the US, there's approximately 800,000 children as well as adults living with at least one or more symptoms of cerebral palsy. The prevalence rate is large and unchanged for the last 40 years. And that's a lot to take in. Okay? Some of the risk factors involved with cerebral palsy includes premature birth, low birth weight, conception of 2 or more fetuses. Then there might be maternal exposure in terms of toxins or infections, meaning the mom might have been smoking, the mom might have been drinking alcohol, or had a lack of oxygen during the birth process. The fetus might not have been getting enough oxygen. So there's been children who shown being affected profoundly, extremely, and those individuals would definitely have to have care throughout their entire lives. Others only showed mild impairments where they had to receive only little to no special assistance. And although this is a condition that's doesn't really get progressively worse, early intervention as well as therapies are quite beneficial in helping prevent or delay onset of secondary type of problems. They've also been able to use medications to help control any type of seizures or muscle spasms that have happened. Sometimes they've used surgery to help with the muscles and tendons that were too short to function. Physical therapy has been utilized in terms of helping a child build skills, the necessary motor skills. And there's also been research showing how the use of a drug allow for regrowth of the myelin coating on nerve cells within the brain. So the lack of oxygen sometimes disrupts those nerve cells' ability to create myelin. And then those cells wind up dying off, which leads to the cerebral palsy. So the research that have been conducted, they conducted it on mice, and they found that a drug allowed the myelin sheath to regrow and repair damage, and then allowed for it to be used in humans. They kind of hoped that it would demonstrate that that drug treatment would actually help in terms of traumatic brain injuries. So there's a lot of different techniques and technologies that allow children with cerebral palsy to have a chance in terms of um, improving movement, that being head movement, uh, or to be able to use a voice synthesizer, abilities to use computer, etc. The next disorder I want to talk about is the autistic spectrum disorder. This is a pervasive impairment in terms of social communication and interactions. It's often an individual will be showing a lot of repetitive behaviors, being restricted, concrete, having real narrow focus on interests or activities. And the impairment is on a continuum. It can be from mild to severe, with the severity being determined by the amount of support that an individual would need in daily functioning. So they're going to show some children that are autistics, they would have a hard time with communication in terms that they really are not able to speak well. And then there'll be other children that show less severe symptoms, may speak normally, demonstrate high brain functioning in terms of having high levels of IQ, but they have difficulties in terms of being able to socially interact with other people. They might have problems with one-on-one conversations. They might be extremely literal and concrete. Um, those who do show symptoms in early childhood, even if it wasn't caught or wasn't diagnosed till later on, over those years, there's a number of different causes that the autistic spectrum disorder would have demonstrated, including biological bases as well as other environmental factors. Now, another disorder, schizophrenia. Now, schizophrenia in children, I have to say, first and foremost, is one of those disorders that, as a psychologist, we like to stay clear of. Understand that schizophrenia is a very rare but it's extremely serious mental disorder that affects at least 0.3 to 0.7% of the population. And pretty much it's related to both structural and functional differences in our brains. So diagnosis requires at least two or more of the following type of symptoms, that being delusions. And now y'all know that delusions is talking about an individual who may think they believe that something exists when it doesn't exist to you and I, but for them it's real. It might be unrealistic, and those fixed beliefs can be like sense of paranoia. They're feeling prosecuted, or they feel grandiose. They feel like they're high above in a power type of role. And then there's hallucinations, and there's different types of hallucinations. You have auditory, you have visual hallucinations, you have tactile hallucinations that can be associated. But the most common, and I want y'all to hear what I said, the most common type of hallucination exhibited is generally going to be auditory, because we've had a lot in terms of patients saying that they're hearing voices, and now a lot of people hear voices. They hear their own. So if you see somebody talking to themselves, do not automatically assume that they're hearing voices. You want to kind of investigate that situation, particularly when it comes to children. Why? Why would we be really concerned about seeing a child speak to themselves or talking to themselves? Imagination. A lot of times children have make-believe friends. Doesn't mean necessarily that they're delusional. Doesn't mean necessarily that they're having hallucinations. And this is why when I say we try to avoid the diagnosis of schizophrenia in a child, those are some of the reasons why we would try to avoid. Other symptoms that might be present is disorganized speech, disorganized or catatonic type of behaviors, where, for example, they might not react to things going on in the everyday world. Or they might show negative type symptoms. And this is when there's blunt or flat affect in the terms of showing very little emotions toward things. They might not demonstrate any type of self-motivated behaviors in terms of properly taking care of themselves, brushing their teeth, combing their hair, clean clothes. They might look disheveled. All of these different type of symptoms, by the way, really need to be present for at least 30 days, 1 month. Okay, so any type of symptoms, they're going to usually appear in late adolescence, and that's male specifically, really. It would be generally in late adolescence, and for females, we tend to find it happening in their late 20s to early to mid 30s. Okay, but there's been very rare amount of cases where children actually, younger teens like 10 or 11 years old, develop the disorder. But when it does happen, and I didn't say it never happens, we like to avoid it, but there are times when it is present. We refer to that as early onset schizophrenia. So schizophrenia might not be diagnosed until adolescence, but a lot of times the disorder is preceded either by a gradual deterioration in their social and cognitive functioning, or the ongoing difficulties that they demonstrate in those areas. Once schizophrenia happens or develops, functioning within these areas will start to progressively get worse, which will result in a person having difficulty dealing with social, academic, or occupational type functioning. Their daily functioning will definitely demonstrate a decrease. All right, let's move to senses, our development of our senses. With newborns, although they're capable of focusing their eyes, vision for a newborn is extremely bad in comparison to an adult's vision. It's really difficult to be able to measure visual acuity of young infants, and that's visual acuity is talking about their ability to see things in sharp details. However, there's been an estimate at birth that acuity is basically around 2400 to 2800. What does that mean? That's talking about how the infant can only see about 20 feet, where an adult with normal vision we can see at least 400 to 800 feet away. Here's the thing though, by the first month, the acuity starts to improve. it jumps from 2400 to 2200 range, of 2200 to 2400. When they're 6 months, it gets to 2025, and then by 3 months, pretty much that child is going to be able to see objects that are 8 to 10 inches in front of them. So things, as it gets better, it gets closer, they're able to see more details easier. One of the reasons why we often put our faces close to an infant when we're talking to them is because they really can't see us clear. It's like, they're farsighted, okay? They can't see close at that age. So until they can, it's putting, how you like to hold a baby and put the baby right there in your face? That's when they can see you well. So they don't really develop adult levels of visual acuity until they're around 6 months to 3 years, between that age space. But one thing I do want to say is, from birth, infants are attracted to looking at faces of people around them. Instead of always an object around, they love to look at people's faces. Yeah, especially mom. Additionally, they'll concentrate on those areas that has a high contrast. That is, where the darkest dark meets the lightest light. They're going to pinpoint that. They're going to look for that more. And at first, this can seem to be where they scan a hairline, unless the person's bald, and then they don't have the hairline to work with. But usually this happens around 2 months of age, approximately. The concentration on the attention of the eyes, where the white of the eye is going to surround a dark center. When they're looking at mom's face and they're looking at their eyes, they'll see those pupils and everything, the cornea and everything, and that's what they're focused on. All right, let's talk about hearing. Our hearing actually becomes functional while we're still in the womb, believe it or not. Okay, the fetus, they start hearing sounds and they hear it loud, and guess who's the first one they get to hear? They get to hear mom. Okay, and there's been studies that have been able to show that during that prenatal phase, fetuses do respond differently to the sound of their mother's voice, and they kind of have an understanding of when it's their mother in comparison when their mom is talking to somebody else and they hear another woman's voice. They're able to distinguish while in the womb. Okay, things that they say though is you want to be careful not to overstimulate the fetus. There have been some studies that suggest that overstimulation actually kind of makes it more difficult for them to filter and not be able to distinguish as well. But I know that as far as my children are concerned, when I was carrying them, back then they had Walkmans. They didn't have the iPods at that point, or the use of a smartphone to be able to listen to music. And using regular little pods, we had the big old-fashioned headphones, which thankfully that's making a comeback. But I used to put them on top of my stomach and just lay it there and let them hear some Motown or some jazz, and they've all become musically inclined because they love music. So go figure. All right. So now, in terms of smell and taste, babies are going to be born with this functioning sense of smell that pretty much shows a preference of some over others. Even at the ripe age of 4 days old, babies who are bottle fed shows a preference for the smell of the breast milk. Everyone's like, can we get the good stuff? Okay. But they also know that their mother's smell is going to be, they'll know mom before anybody else's. Research has also demonstrated babies who are being breastfed will recognize mother's scent much quicker, and it's going to happen within the first 2 weeks of life in comparison to those bottle fed. Babies are going to be soothed by the scent of mom's clothes because they're accustomed to the scent. Infants, in terms of taste, like sweet, which, let me give you fair warning, don't always give them sweet. Why? Because then that's all they're going to want to desire. But they prefer the sweet taste, and they will act negatively toward those salty, sour, or bitter tastes. You know, and I'm one of those individuals. I don't care for anything, and I'm in my middle age now, middle adulthood, okay? Not too far from elderly, but I still prefer sweet over bitter, but I do like salt. But getting back to the topic at hand, mother's milk is considered to be sweet. The breast milk is sweet, so the baby is going to enjoy that type of food from mom. And it actually has a calming effect on infants when they're having those sweets, that desirable taste that they get. It also helps in the reduction of pain when they're going through any type of painful procedures. So, mom take you to the dentist to get your teeth clean. That's not a good example. Let's not use the dentist. Dentist won't give you a lollipop, but a physician will when you have to get your vaccination. So that's a great example for that. In terms of talking about breast milk, the second thing about it is the amniotic fluid has this chemosensory type of molecule within it. So whatever the mom eats, of course, the baby's going to get in the breast milk. So the flavors from that food is also going to be infused within the breast milk. So it means that mom had a chocolate cake before having to feed the baby. Guess what the baby tastes? Chocolate. So let's go ahead and keep talking and moving on. All right. Touch. Infants love touch. Okay. It's really soothing for an infant to be touched. There have been studies, of course, and the research has been able to demonstrate that babies who are held skin to skin with their moms cry less than when given a slightly painful medical procedure, like getting that shot in the arm. So adults who've had a massage, they know how relaxing the massage is. So guess what? Infant massage is really part of the everyday experience of a baby in many ways. In different regions of the world, they do give babies massages. I used to love massaging my children's legs. One, I didn't want them bow-legged. I wanted them to have nice straight legs. So after a bath, he would always give the nice massage, and it would put them to sleep. Booyah. But in other countries like India, Uganda, Bali, babies are given a massage with oils after their bath and before put to bed, and they sleep through the night. Now, besides feeling good, infants do feel pain. And in terms of talking about pain, one of the things we have to understand is that it's at very early age. So when we're talking about like a circumcision, and I know when I had started having children, they would say, oh, the baby doesn't feel it. Yes, the baby felt that pain, okay? Babies feel pain from the time that they come out the womb. The process of coming out the womb, excuse me, probably was just as traumatic. And usually it's the mothers holding them to help them. That touch again, skin to skin contact helps to soothe them. And it can make you think about the gate control theory. You know how if you've had my courses before and we talked about gate control theory, talked about how if you get a paper cut, which I got one last week. And the only thing I would do is constantly press on it. So that what am I doing? I'm letting it flooding those pain receptors so it takes my mind off of the initial pain. You could think the same thing in terms of an infant who's feeling pain. If the mom is constantly rubbing on them, touching on them when they're getting the shot, it soothes them. So when they're holding them, rubbing them, as the shot comes, it's not as painful as if you were just laying the baby on the table and sticking the baby in the arm. Take away the concentration on that area for pain. All right. So, a lot of talking. But I kind of missed our conversations, and it's all about me providing this information. Be sure to read your textbooks because I'm giving you some of it, but not all of it. You have to read. But getting back to development of senses, when we're talking about infants, starting even at birth, they're going to show some type of cross-modal transfers of their perceptions. Okay? But their abilities are going to be quite limited. So they might be able to visually see and recognize something that they have only touched and not seen. But they're not really able to recognize touch in the same ways as we think. Something that they might have just seen but not previously touched. So they might not recognize what it is easy. These type of abilities will get better as an infant gets older, and they're gonna demonstrate and have more experiences. They'll be seeing a lot more, touching a lot more. They'll start hearing and smelling and tasting. So those senses are gonna develop the older they get. And it's a crossover. So when we're talking about cross-modal transfer of perception, it's those times when it's crossing over where they might not have initially knew what they was touching, but as they're seeing it, those connections are going to start to build. All right, body growth and development. Here's when the child is going to start really demonstrating development and getting bigger and bigger. Of course, all babies are beautiful, aren't they? But beyond that, here's some things physically that they do share that draws us to those sweet, adorable darlings. So when they're born, there's comparative proportions of their heads and bodies that's very different from when they grow up and become adults like us. Okay? So they start out when they're born, they have this really large head. The proportion to their head is almost more head than body, basically. They also have larger eyes. They have tiny little nose and mouths. And they have these adorable fat cheeks. Also, there might be some evolutionary reasons for why their appearance is this way. It does make babies look cute, and we're attracted to seeing them, but this attraction becomes even stronger for women who have larger amounts of reproductive hormones in their system. And it's that secret that few parents will reveal, is that there are some aspects of caring for a child or baby that's really unpleasant, because they really don't feel like dealing with dirty diapers. They don't want to be dealing with the funky smells, having to be up all night. So it's where that look helps us get through it all. Okay? We're generally going to protect an infant and nurture an infant even with those difficulties at hand. Partly because it's the effect of those proportions that gets us every time. Growth during infancy as well as up to around age 2 though is extremely fast. On average, an infant will double in their weight at about 5 months of age. It triples then by the first birthday. So around this time, infants, they'll pretty much add at least 10 inches or at least 50% of their length at birth. And that same rate is going to really apply to that of an 11 or 12-year-old. So think of it, that's kind of horrifying to see it all go that fast. But generally speaking, after the second birthday, it do start slowing down in terms of growth up until puberty. But 2 year olds are half the weight they'll be when they're an adult. Half. Can you believe that? If they're proportionally correct, that is, and not dealing with some problems that some of us may have, like obesity. We'll talk more about that later. But their height is usually can be seen as double that of a 2 year old. But here's the thing, and me and my son, we get into this all the time. We argue about it, actually. We just had one recently in which I expressed to him, I think he's 6'4", 6'5", and he's like, "No, Mom, I'm only 6'3", and I'm like, "Oh yeah, you're 6'4", 6'5", because I'm 5'9", and I'm relatively not a short person, but when I stand next to him, I look like a dwarf." Okay, and I have all my sons are 6 feet and over, and when you see him standing next to them, he looks humongous. So he's like, "No, it's not like that." But anyway, we'll argue all day about that. He sent me texts trying to show me pictures, and I'm like, it doesn't work. But regardless, at birth he was 2 feet long. Okay, and that was at birth. So by the time he was 2 years old, he actually was standing over 3 feet already, meaning he was already half his size. I still say he's about 6'4" at least, but I'm a mother. I told him I win regardless of what he thinks. But a better indicator actually about the height is looking at family. So I can tell you my parents, they were munchkins in comparison to me. My mom was 5 feet, my father was 5'1", but their parents, it was a different story. Both my grandfathers were 6 feet and over. So hence, that's where I got my height. Same holds true in terms of the fraternal side for my children. Their father was only 5'6", but their grandfathers and their great-grandfather were both tall men. So genetically speaking, it skipped a generation as far as with their father, and it landed onto them. Now, there's a lot of different environmental factors that go involved with this in terms of growth and height. If you haven't heard this story, which you probably have if you take an introduction to psychology, but that's okay, you're gonna hear it again. My youngest son, by the time he was 16 years old, he was going on 16, he was still under 5 feet. He was about 4'11", and he was so worried that he wasn't going to grow, not at all. And I expressed to him that if he did like his brothers, because his brothers, they both were already close to the 6 feet range, I said, if you go to sleep and eat your vegetables, take care of yourself, I guarantee you will grow. So I guess he thought he was going to prove me wrong, because he said, "Well, Dad's short, you're 5'9", but I don't see it." And I said, "Try it." So he started getting a full night's worth of sleep for a whole year. He started eating his vegetables. He found he loved broccoli and spinach, so he got an abundance of broccoli and spinach. Well, within that year, he went from 4'11" all the way to 6 feet. When we talk about a growth spurt, he went like a beanstalk, okay? It's where you have to know that with adequate nutrition, height will, and it's also genetics. Genetics do play a big part. But if you're taking care of yourself, it's going to be able to play a huge part in the development of growth. Um, so, as hopefully, oh, one question: when do you stop growing? Now we're talking about childhood, I know, but do you know how old you are when you literally stop growing? Think about it. Okay, I can't hold it anymore. You're in your mid-20s when you actually stop growing. I initially, when I started having children, was 5'6", and I always tease. I said each child gave me an inch. Uh, during my pregnancies, I got an inch taller. I am 5'9", and I'm 5'9". I thank my children because while carrying them, my growth hormone increased, not only to help them, but it helped me. I was eating better, I was sleeping more, so that helped increase my height to 5'9". Go figure. But we do grow at least to age 25. Not everybody, but most. And remember genetics. All right, so we talked about I talked about my son and his antics, and we talked about the growth hormone playing a huge part in the process for child development. As that children's rate of growth slows in early childhood, it's the torso and the limbs, it'll start catching up in the size from that earlier growth of the head, and those body proportions are going to start to even out, so to speak. So in your textbook, you'll see that they have a figure, and that's 6.7. That kind of shows you the process of how the head looks relative to the body and how it changes from birth until they're about 15 and a half years old. So know that the growth centers are going to be found at the end of the bones, and it'll remain soft up until adolescence somewhere, and it ends up hardening. And then finally, like I said, is actually within the mid-20s, close to mid-20s, that growth will finally stop. But during early childhood, realize that our proportions as far as body fat and muscle is continuously changing. The layers of the subcutaneous fat that a 5-year-old may possess will start thickening by 9 months old. So young children start to lose that chubbiness they look, that baby fat, as we might call it as moms. Um, Boys and girls, they start to lose that baby fat and start gaining muscles during early childhood. It's going to be slightly different in proportions though. So usually by the time they're 5, girls are going to be a little more heavier than boys, depending on, again, environmental factors. If they're eating correctly, proper nutrition, proper rest. But boys will have more muscle than girls will at that point. Then in childhood, it's going to start settling down. Growth rate will be okay during middle childhood, and they'll be adding at least 2 inches of height each year, approximately. Also, in terms of weight, it should be around 6.5, 7 pounds as far as growth weight. So, know that that's with the bones. Now, teeth, babies are usually, but I have seen newborn infants with the outline of their teeth already starting to produce. But they're generally going to be born toothless. But during that first year, teeth will start emerging. And we start losing our teeth, the baby teeth as they call them, the first set around 6 years old. And they'll grow a new set, but if they start losing that next set, they're not going to get a new one. All right, so we're getting to that point where we're out of infancy, we've moved into the early childhood, we've gone through some of the middle childhood, and now we're coming to what we call prepubescence. And these are those years that's going to be immediately that happens before puberty, when all these hormonal changes will start. And the earliest events within those pubertal sequences is going to happen usually in that middle childhood. But again, this is approximation, because it may happen sooner for some folks. So these type of pubertal changes, they can range within those ages that starts, at some point between ages 5 and 9. You can think of prepubescence that early. The adrenal glands are going to start to produce more androgens, both boys and girls. Hormones will start to get linked to that growth spurt, as I mentioned, in which once we've reached puberty, you'll start really seeing physical changes happening in terms of, for males, you'll see increased muscle mass, you'll see more facial hair, uh, pubic, armpit, all that, everything starts growing amok. Girls, you're going to see uh, the formation of breasts. Their monarch will begin, or menstruation. So, and boys, they do also at this time, in terms of when we're talking about primary sex characteristics, is called the spumarch. Monarch is for girls, spumarch is for boys. Okay. So, in terms of when we talk about the type of hormones that's being produced, now understand estrogen and testosterone is in both genders, males and females. However, the difference is females will have more estrogen, males will have more testosterone. Okay, but we both possess both hormones. So when we're talking about secondary sex characteristics, it's usually going to be associated with gender, but it's pertaining more to the sex organs. And again, that's where we're talking about with females, the estrogen is going to help in the breast development. Your body's preparing as far as the monarch being able to carry and reproduce. Boys, you'll see they start muscle building, they'll start having a difference in voice. They'll go from that squeaky, quiet little sound to the deep baritone. You understand what I'm saying. All right, so a lot of factors that's included again, as I mentioned already, for growth can same hold true as in terms of our sexual development. We have environmental factors included just as well as genetic. So it's what we inherit, what we eat, if we keep healthy, the type of body we have, our weight, racial and racial background, as well as the timing of puberty. So they have what we call a precocious puberty, and these are for some females, and pretty much it's when they're starting really young. You've heard some females actually starting their monarch at around 7, 8 years old. Okay, and biggest thing in terms of child psychology, why we want to know this in the first place? Well, the time of puberty is going to be relative to how a child develops socially as well as physically. If a child is developed fast, for example, females tend to have that spurt where they're taller than boys at that certain age. When they're like 10 or 11 years old, they're going to be taller. And then as they get older, boys do the catch up. So, but it has significant impact and influences on one's development, particularly mentally and with the psyche. All right. So, some risks we need to look at and discuss in terms of sexual maturation. You know, I know this is child psychology, but you need to know still about an adolescent as well. So, after they go through puberty, this is when males produce valuable sperm, and females, they can become pregnant. Okay, and for a lot of teens growing, they start becoming interested uh, in having sex, plain and simple. So things that we have to be worried about are unwanted pregnancies and even more specifically sexually transmitted diseases and infections. We have to be careful. In the United States, we're one of the highest that's dealing with fertility issues for our adolescents, as you can see in the graph. All right, so now we're moving from the sexual development so you can wipe the sweat off your brows. And let's go back to talking about motor development. So there are newborns that, generally they aren't able to just move and get up and run as soon as they're coming out of the womb. Uh, they don't have much control yet of their limbs, but as they get older, this set of involuntary patterns do start presenting itself and happening. That's what we call reflexes. So here on this chart, it's kind of giving you the different type of reflexes that's noticeable, and actually when they go into their pediatrician to see how development is going for them, they're checking these particular type of reflexes, that being the sucking reflex. Now a newborn can demonstrate this to day one. Okay, all you have to do is just go like this to a baby, and they'll start to go automatically toward that finger in this case, or when they're being breastfed for the nipple. Okay, crawling reflexes, pretty much it starts where they're laying on their tummy, and even though they're not going anywhere, you might notice a baby leg just a kicking and going and moving. That's demonstrating that they already have an ideal about it's supposed to have help them to move. This is occurring around 2 months. That sucking reflex, I beg to differ what the graphic is saying or the slide is saying, because you can actually see it day one, where they're saying about, well, they're saying it actually disappears. I know that a baby can still want to keep going, even around the 2 month age. But crawling reflex is usually occurring. The Morrow reflex, and that's that startle. What you do with that is if you take a baby and lift them by their hands, and you don't lift them way up, don't do that to them, but just lift them just enough where their arms come up off the bed, and then just let go. They're gonna go like this. Okay, they start to flailing and going all over because they feel like they lost their support. So that lets you know that they have what they call that startle reflex. This dude's try to disappear around approximately 3 months. And if you pick a baby up and just put their feet down on the hard surface, the reflex of automatically wanting to move, they start to getting those legs a kicking like they're gonna walk away. That's the stepping reflex. The list goes on, but do go over these, and it'll let you know the different reflexes. You want to kind of have an idea of all the reflexes. Make sure you read them in your chapter, because you never know when there's a test question. All right, so we have a few more slides, about 7 more, and I'm going to try to get through this because we're already past an hour mark. But because this is going all week, y'all have to still deal with me. But anyway, let's keep it moving. In terms of developing the motor skills, children are going to develop both gross motor skills, in which that's where the larger muscle groups of the body, like our legs, is going to be developing, as well as finer motor skills. And there's fine motor skills is including small movements, mostly like with our hand and our fingers, hand and eye coordination, as well as our lips, being able to get them to move appropriately. A lot of times when you have someone who is not using their tongue and mouth properly when they're speaking, it's because they haven't gotten that coordination down right yet. Sometimes we have to call in a speech pathologist to help with that. But on a normal time, that's what that time of development would help with. Our conscious motor activity is going to be controlled more by our motor cortex in the brain. And remember, that's located right behind the frontal lobe. So that motor cortex, it'll go across the brain from ear to ear. Think of it like this. Like if you put a band on, that band is our motor cortex, okay? Now, y'all know you're going to say, wow, you keep talking about myelination. Myelination, again, remember, it's an important part of our neurons in helping with communication and speed, but it helps our motor neurons because it helps connect our brain with the spinal cord. And it allows our body to be in sync with our nervous system. It works better because of it. We need that fatty substance known as myelin. It's not only for neurons, but it's also for those motor neurons in the body. And the myelination of those motor neurons is far from being finished when the child is born. The cephalocaudal direction of motor skills, this just lets you know, and if you're looking at the slide, is holding up the head, the child's ability to roll over, sitting up, and crawling. Now, I would give you the age ranges, but I want you to do some reading because it lets you know when. I will say, though, in terms of hold up head, like I said, my son was born 2 feet long, okay? And he had a big, huge head. But after a few days, he was already lifting it up. He didn't have it all the way up, but he was able to get it where his chin was barely touching the bed anymore. It's an approximation, but on average, I want you to tell me what ages are for what. All right. So we talked about motor development and we talked about how it all works with the motor cortex and the location of the motor cortex. Now let's talk about the uh, proximal motor distal direction, okay? More or less, as mentioned, I talked about the cephalocaudal direction, and that basically is really head to toe. If I didn't mention that, I'm sorry if I didn't. But uh, here and again, the torso out to the extremities of the fingers is what we call the proximal distal direction, and it's heading from the center of that body out towards the extremities. So infants will gain control of their bodies as well as the sequence and helping reflect those different patterns of myelination. So we'll see that the sequence of motor milestones in turn is given by parents is going to be jot down in books, but it helps and talks about how there's a control of their limbs and their hands. So you have the palmar grasp, the pincer grasp, and the tripod grasp. How they're able to pick up and hold things are based on these three different tasks. Again, go back to the reading. All right. Additionally, as children get older, they're getting more control of their bodies and they're becoming aware. Now, one of the biggest issues and problems I think parents have is because of how they were reared and raised, is that they find that when babies are exploring their body, it is taboo. When you do become a parent, if you become a parent, allow your child to explore themselves because this allows them to have more about their body awareness. The proprioception is having a sense of where everything is located in terms of time and space on the body. So when a male child, infant, for example, or toddler, reaches and touches their penis, do not tap the hand or startle them into making them think it's wrong. Simply explain what part of the body it is for them. Same holds true for females. All right, so there are some type of motor disabilities that do occur, and although we do expect to see some variability within that, uh, children are going to reach their milestones at different times. Uh, in talking about disorders, the DSM-5, they have a condition that's called the developmental coordination disorder. And it's talking about how there are delays in a child reaching particular milestones that might deal with daily functioning, okay, or deal with learning or their academic performances. So it's generally going to be found in noticed symptoms will show for a young child that's having real problems with reaching some of these milestones. That being sitting up, being able to walk, starting to be able to jump or move in manners that we're accustomed to, like standing on their foot and so forth. Um, Over time, these difficulties actually can interfere with social development uh, as well as intellectual development, because a child might not be able to play with other children, or their academic performance is going to be kind of stunted during school. So even though these problems do appear in earlier life, diagnosis would generally wouldn't be made unless the child was around 5 years of age, okay? And that's simply because with these age ranges, we, like I said, it's approximations. Not all children will walk at 8 months old. Some might not walk until they're 12 months. Some won't walk till they're 14, 15 months. But if it's where they're around 2 years old and then they haven't been able to walk at that point at 24 months, then there's a concern there. Okay, we might have those type of motor disabilities present. So just know that that's a condition that's going to delay those motor milestones, and it definitely can interfere with development. All right, we talked a lot about breastfeeding already. We know that it's good nutrition. It helps build an immune system within the infant as they get older. The only thing I do recommend is having a decent and respectable time to allow a child to become a little more independent and not be drinking constantly from a breast, even when they're 3 or 4 years old. You can still give them breast milk, but allow them to be able to use a bottle or use a cup as they get older. That's my recommendation anyway. All right, we already spoke about how good nutrition includes healthy eating, and it helps with positive development in a lot of areas, particularly like with growth and so forth. But there are times when we have to be concerned with, in child psychology, how proper food is necessary and sometimes not available when we have what we call food insecurities. And unfortunately, Mississippi is one of the states that have over 19 different counties in its state that children deal with food insecurity. Right now, we're living with COVID-19 virus. And one of the biggest issues and worries and concerns is with the closing of schools. Uh, and that's right now not just us as far as higher education, but K through 12. Worried about children being able to get proper nourishment from food, because a lot of parents did rely on schools helping them with their children with feeding. And thankfully, we're stepping up to the plate where parents are able to go with their child to pick up breakfast, lunch for them, and it helps to alleviate problems with not having the proper nutrition due to financial constraints. But it allows the child to have that, so we don't have to worry about malnutrition or undernutrition. All right. So, of course, we're getting ready to wrap up. I'm coming down to the last of it pretty much, but we're going to talk a little bit about obesity and overweight. And unfortunately, again, Mississippi is a high ranking state for this particular area. But being overweight or obese, it can have really negative effects and consequences for children. One of the main things we have to consider when we're talking about obesity is that children that are obese as a child tends to be obese as an adolescent, and that then moves into adulthood. So there's a big concern for that. And we also know that when there's children that's overweight or obese, we have to start worrying about other life-threatening type of diseases like diabetes, heart disease, and so forth, even asthma. So these are concerns that we have to be worried about. Now, in terms of when we're talking about eating disorders, there are two main ones that I want you to recall, that being anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. So with anorexia nervosa, now this is a disorder where the individuals, they're going to restrict their intake of food because they think that they are fat or overweight. And because of this restriction, they can get to the point where they're putting their life on the line. So one of the things that we have to work with individuals is because they, no matter what, they see themselves, even if they weigh only 90 pounds and they're a 22-year-old at 90 pounds, they still see themselves as overweight rather than thin, too thin. And that those thoughts and feelings of being so overweight is what perpetuates and exacerbates the condition itself. Now, in terms of how a person looks, you can kind of tell an individual who might be suffering from anorexia nervosa because they are extremely underweight and they're really thin. And some people, you actually can start seeing their bones without sitting up out of the skin. But in terms of bulimia nervosa, now these individuals have problems as far as with their weight, but you might not actually recognize a person who's bulimic. These individuals will purge and they'll take laxatives, but they tend to binge eat and then do the purging. They might have a difficult time with something, go and eat nonstop, and then instead of letting it stay where they feel it's going to make them heavy, they will either regurgitate it by vomiting, or like I said, they'll go and take laxatives. They might do extreme exercising, which, by the way, those who's with anorexia nervosa, they like to exercise like that too. They tend to do really tiny portions. They'll say that's too much. So those are the two different eating disorders that's present. We also do have a third one that's not listed in your textbooks, but it does have to do possibly with obesity and overweight, and that is binge eating. You do have some people who are emotional eaters. You have people who will binge eat and they'll just eat nonstop. They don't want to stop eating. But rather than do like bulimia nervosa, they don't do anything. They just eat and let it sit, and then that's when you have to be concerned about obesity. All right, so that's a wrap for chapter 6. There is, like I said, in the module section, I want you to make sure that you check out the videos that's attached in that module. There are journal articles that I need you to read, and underneath this video lecture, you should also find an assignment that I need you to complete. On that note, have a great week. Assignments are due Friday at 11:59 p.m. Please make sure that you have them in on time. They are considered your attendance for the week. Have a great one. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to pass me a note on into the inbox, and I will be happy to answer you. I will be looking at my emails and inbox, my messages, Monday through Friday. Okay, weekends I will start taking breaks. So please make sure or understand that if you send me something after 5 on Friday, you might not receive an answer till Monday morning. On that note, have a great week again. Stay safe. Keep doing what you're supposed to do and protect yourself from COVID-19. Bye.